The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest, most continuous military campaign of the Second World War. It was a conflict waged not on land, but across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open ocean. The German U-boat, or undersea boot, became the terrifying symbol of this maritime struggle. For years, these steel sharks stalked the shipping lanes, cutting the vital supply line between North America and Great Britain. Commanded by Admiral Karl Donitz, the U-boat arm, or Kriegsmarine, achieved remarkable, almost unbelievable success in the early years. They hunted in ruthless wolf packs, surfacing at night to reload torpedo tubes and recharge the massive batteries required for submerged travel. The simple necessity of breathing and refueling their diesel engines, however, was also their greatest weakness. When a U-boat was forced to surface, it became a visible target, albeit a small one, for Allied air and sea patrols. The sheer volume of Allied shipping losses threatened to choke the British Isles into submission. This was a war of attrition, where every sunken freighter and every damaged tanker was a strategic victory for the German High Command. The Allied forces were constantly innovating, rapidly deploying new escort carriers, improved sonar, and better coordination between air and naval assets. But the U-boats were an ever-present, ghostly threat, their presence felt through the sudden, violent destruction of convoys. German commanders, buoyed by the triumphs of the happy time and the early war years, held an almost unshakable faith in the U-boat's inherent supremacy. They believed that for every countermeasure the Allies devised, German ingenuity would find an answer to maintain the strategic advantage. The commanders fully trusted the core doctrine of aggressive, submerged attack and rapid nighttime surface retreats. This confidence was based on the undeniable fact that a U-boat submerged was still incredibly difficult to find and destroy. The only limitation was the oxygen they breathed and the fuel they needed, a limitation the German engineers were desperate to overcome. By early 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was beginning to turn dramatically against the German U-boats. The months leading up to May of that year saw an escalating deployment of Allied countermeasures that proved devastatingly effective. New technologies like the high-frequency direction finding, or HFDF, known to the Allies as Huff Duff, allowed convoys to pinpoint the location of U-boats when they transmitted radio messages. The closing of the Mid-Atlantic Gap, once a safe haven for the wolf packs, through the use of escort carriers and very long-range aircraft, was a crippling blow. The month of May 1943, however, became the definitive turning point, a catastrophe for the German Navy known simply as Black May. In that single, brutal month, the Kriegsmarine lost an unprecedented 41 U-boats to Allied attacks. This shocking loss rate represented nearly a third of the entire operational U-boat fleet. The Allied forces, utilizing improved radar and air patrols that could now cover the entirety of the North Atlantic, made surfacing an almost guaranteed death sentence. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted, and the former confidence of the German commanders evaporated. Admiral Donitz was forced to temporarily withdraw the majority of his U-boats from the primary North Atlantic convoy routes. The strategic reality was stark. The U-boat had lost its core advantage of invisibility when it had to emerge from the depths. The older doctrine of night surface attacks was no longer viable against the new generation of Allied radar. The German High Command desperately needed a technological leap, a revolutionary solution that would restore the U-boat's operational freedom and stealth. The failure was not in the courage of the crews, who remained fiercely dedicated, but in the vulnerability of the technology itself. The need for diesel engine operation to recharge batteries, a process that required vast amounts of fresh air, was the fatal flaw exposed by Allied air power. This existential crisis drove the immediate and urgent adoption of any promising innovation that could keep the U-boat submerged for longer periods. The pressure to reverse the catastrophic losses of Black May was immense, demanding a radical change in both design and operational tactics. The solution to the U-boat's fatal vulnerability was not a new weapon, but a deceptively simple piece of engineering known as the snorkel. The concept of an underwater air-breathing apparatus was not entirely new, having been explored by Dutch engineers prior to the war. It was, at its core, a collapsible pipe, extending from the U-boat's conning tower to just above the surface of the water. This mast served two critical purposes simultaneously while the U-boat remained submerged at periscope depth. First, it brought fresh air down to run the powerful diesel engines, which could now operate underwater. Second, it vented the noxious exhaust gases back out into the atmosphere, preventing the buildup of toxic fumes inside the cramped hull. The snorkel eliminated the necessity of surfacing to recharge the electric batteries, which were essential for silent, fully submerged movement. The batteries could now be constantly topped up while the boat was under the water, allowing for continuous, submerged operation. This meant a snorkel-equipped U-boat could theoretically remain underwater for weeks at a time, entirely independent of the surface. The logistical and tactical implications of this invention were nothing short of revolutionary for the beleaguered German fleet. The U-boat once again had a degree of invisibility that Allied technology had only just managed to strip away. The initial designs were often retrofitted to existing Type VIC U-boats, leading to various operational challenges, but the potential was clear. A critical feature was the automatic valve, or an head valve, at the top of the mast. This valve would instantly snap shut upon contact with a wave, preventing seawater from flooding the diesel engines and the submarine's interior. This rapid closure, while saving the engines, caused a sudden and often violent drop in air pressure inside the boat. The temporary vacuum effect could be painful, but it was a small price to pay for operational safety and extended submerged time. The snorkel was the great hope, promising to restore the U-boat to its status as the Atlantic's unseen, dominant predator. For Admiral Karl Donitz and the U-boat Command, BDU, the snorkel was more than a technology, it was a life raft for a sinking campaign. Following the crippling losses of Black May, the morale of the U-boat crews was severely tested, and a tangible success was desperately needed. The German commanders placed enormous strategic trust in the snorkel, viewing it as the decisive answer to Allied air superiority and radar. They reasoned that if the U-boats could simply remain submerged, the Allied advantage would be entirely negated. The snorkel allowed the U-boats to cross the Atlantic entirely underwater, making their transit to and from patrol areas undetectable by air patrols. This technological development was immediately prioritized, and massive effort was poured into retrofitting the existing fleet and incorporating it into new designs. Donitz saw the snorkel as the necessary bridge until the revolutionary, fast attack Type XXI electroboats could be fully deployed. The High Command's faith was rooted in the logic of the system: a submarine is safest underwater, and the snorkel made it possible to stay there indefinitely. Operational doctrine was swiftly rewritten to center around the snorkel's capabilities, emphasizing submerged patrol and attack. Commanders were instructed to use the device judiciously, raising it only for the brief periods necessary to recharge and refresh the boat's atmosphere. The strategic objective shifted from surface wolfpack attacks to slow, silent, submerged stalking of convoys. This adaptation reflected a fundamental acceptance that the days of the U-boat as a surface vessel were over. The expectation was that once the Snorkel fleet was fully operational, the attrition rates would plummet and the tonnage war could be renewed. The commanders believed they had bought themselves a crucial, game-changing period of technological grace. This belief fueled a new wave of confidence, a quiet determination to return to the Atlantic and prove the resilience of the U-boat arm. The success of the Snorkel was considered non-negotiable for the continuation of the German naval war effort. The operational phase of the Snorkel U-boats began in earnest, ushering in an entirely new and difficult form of naval warfare. The U-boat speed while snorting was severely limited, usually restricted to a slow, methodical pace of only a few knots. The extended mast created significant drag, making high-speed maneuvering underwater nearly impossible. A Snorkel U-boat was often blind and deaf while operating with the mast up, having to rely on the limited visibility of the periscope. The noise generated by the running diesel engines, though muffled by the water, was still a concern for Allied hydrophones. However, the most important factor was the near-perfect invisibility it afforded the submarine against airborne detection. From the air, all that was visible was the small, thin top of the Snorkel mast, often obscured by wave spray and the general chaos of the open ocean. The Snorkel era restored the U-boat's ability to approach convoys with a stealth that had been lost for over a year. Allied aircrews initially struggled to adapt to this vanishing act, their previous radar sets proving ineffective against the tiny target. The Snorkel also allowed U-boats to wait out storms and unfavorable conditions while remaining submerged, preserving crew strength and operational readiness. This was the golden period for the late-war U-boat, where the command believed the technological advantage had been reclaimed. The German commander's faith in the Snorkel was justified by the initial difficulty Allied forces had in locating and attacking them. They were operating as true submarines for the first time, not merely as submersible surface ships. The U-boat had traded speed for survivability, and in the deadly game of the Atlantic, survivability was the new priority. The stealth was so profound that U-boats could often transit through heavily guarded areas with impunity. While the Snorkel was a technological savior, it was a physical and psychological torment for the U-boat crews. The extended periods of continuous submergence created a perpetually dark, damp, and airless environment. Life aboard a Snorkel U-boat was an exercise in extreme, prolonged confinement. The air inside the boat was often stale and foul, heavy with the smell of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and bilge water. Despite the Snorkel venting most of the exhaust, a residual smell and taste of unburnt fuel oil permeated everything. The constant risk of the head valve failing and allowing a massive inflow of seawater was a source of persistent, low-grade anxiety. When the valve did close rapidly due to a large wave, the sudden vacuum could cause excruciating pain in the ears and sinuses of the crew. This agonizing pressure change was a common, unavoidable event during heavy weather operations. The slow, deliberate pace of snorting operations meant that patrols dragged on, extending the mental strain to the breaking point. The U-boats moved like blind turtles, requiring immense patience and stamina from the commanders and their men. The ability to see the outside world was restricted to the periscope, providing only a limited, flickering view of the sea. The commanders bore the heaviest weight, responsible for maintaining discipline and morale in these wretched conditions. Sleep was difficult, broken, and unrefreshing due to the constant noise and the lack of proper ventilation. The sheer darkness reinforced the feeling of being trapped in a metal coffin deep beneath the hostile waves. Every day under the Snorkel was a testament to the crew's dedication, enduring misery for the sake of the mission. The commanders who trusted the Snorkel were also asking their men to endure a new, unprecedented level of hardship and suffering. The sudden proliferation of snorkel-equipped U-boats presented the Allied anti-submarine warfare teams with a completely new dilemma. The traditional tactics that had proven so successful in 1943 suddenly became ineffective against this new, elusive enemy. The older generation of airborne radar, which relied on longer wavelengths, could not reliably pick up the narrow, wave-drenched snorkel mast. Visual sightings from aircraft, which had been a critical component of the air-sea battle, became almost impossible against the tiny target. The U-boats were now able to remain submerged even in areas where air patrols were heavy and persistent. The only viable method of detection was the use of sonar from surface escort vessels, which was still limited in range and prone to environmental interference. A snorkel U-boat could often hear the surface vessel before the surface vessel could reliably locate it. This reversal of fortune caused significant confusion and alarm within the Allied commands. The Allied forces had successfully defended the convoys, but the new threat meant the war was far from over. It became a game of excruciatingly slow chance, with aircraft flying hundreds of patrols and sighting nothing. The U-boat commanders felt their new technological defense was impenetrable, and for a short time, they were correct. The inability to reliably detect the snorkel mast was a major technological and psychological setback for the Allies. The entire anti-submarine warfare doctrine had to be urgently reviewed and adapted to the realities of the true submarine. Allied scientists and engineers were immediately tasked with developing a new form of radar that could overcome this significant stealth advantage. The Allied forces knew the Snorkel was their opponent's only real hope, and thus, eliminating its tactical value was the new, central objective. The dilemma was clear: evolve the technology, or face a renewed, deadly U-boat threat. The Allied response to the Snorkel was not one of panic, but of immediate, focused scientific effort. The urgency of the situation triggered an intensified phase of the war's technological arms race. Allied scientists understood that the existing ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar, operating on wavelengths of 1.5 meters or 10 centimeters, was simply not sensitive enough. The problem lay in the physics of radar returns. The snorkel mast was too small and too close to the complex, reflective surface of the waves. The waves themselves created massive clutter on the radar screen, completely masking the tiny, intermittent return from the mast. The breakthrough required a move to a new frequency band, one that could distinguish the metal mast from the surrounding sea noise. The answer lay in the development and rapid deployment of centimetric radar technology. This new generation of radar, operating in the X-band at a wavelength of approximately 3 centimeters, was the result of years of prior research. The short wavelength allowed for a much narrower, more focused beam, which was key to isolating the small target. It also provided a much clearer picture of the surface, drastically reducing the interference caused by sea clutter. The magnetron, a crucial component that generated the high-power, short-wavelength pulses, was the secret weapon enabling this leap. Engineers in Britain and America worked tirelessly to miniaturize and ruggedize this powerful new radar system for installation in aircraft like the Liberator and the Catalina. This was a race against time, with every week of delay translating to more losses in the Atlantic. The focus was no longer on general surveillance, but on creating an unseen eye specifically engineered to spot the snorkel's smallest protrusion. The entire future of the Battle of the Atlantic hinged on the success of these scientists in their quiet laboratories. The deployment of the Centimetric radar marked the pivotal, decisive moment in the war against the Snorkel U-boat. This new radar, particularly the ASV Mark III, operated at a frequency and precision that completely countered the Snorkel's stealth. The shorter, 3-centimeter waves could penetrate the complex noise of the sea surface far more effectively than the older, longer waves. The Snorkel mast, though small, was a perfect reflector of these highly focused radar pulses. The radar operators, now looking at a much clearer screen, could finally distinguish the tinier blips of the Snorkel mast from the surrounding wave reflections. The ability of the Allies to produce and install this technology quickly across their long-range air fleets proved to be overwhelming. The U-boat commanders, who had trusted the Snorkel to be an absolute defense against air attack, were suddenly and completely exposed. They had adopted a technology that was cutting edge, but the Allies had already prepared the counter to the countermeasure. The Centimetric radar did not need to see the entire submarine, only the small, metallic tip of the breathing tube. This single, vital piece of equipment became the U-boat's new, fatal weakness. The breakthrough was a quiet, scientific victory that had immediate and devastating operational consequences on the ocean. The tactical advantage shifted back to the Allied aircraft, who could now patrol the waters with an invisible, all-seeing eye. The technological security that the German commanders had placed in the Snorkel was revealed to be tragically short-lived. The Allied commitment to superior research and development had once again delivered a war-winning edge. The operational impact of the new Centimetric radar was immediate and catastrophic for the U-boat fleet. Allied aircraft, flying their routine patrol patterns, began to record contacts where before there had been only empty ocean. The radar's focused beam would detect the Snorkel mast from miles away, well outside the U-boat's own detection range. The moment the U-boat commander raised the mast to breathe or recharge, a silent alarm was effectively sounding in an enemy cockpit. The Snorkel's very function, to provide air, now became the signal that led to its destruction. The Allied air crews were trained to approach the faint radar blip rapidly, before the U-boat had time to lower the mast and dive deep. Once the contact was established, the aircraft would drop flares and often a radar-guided homing torpedo or depth charges. The U-boats were trapped by their own innovation, unable to maintain speed, depth, and stealth simultaneously. The commanders could no longer trust the ocean's surface to conceal them, even at night or in poor weather. The psychological stress on the U-boat crews intensified as losses began to mount again. They knew they were being found, but they could not understand how the Allies were seeing their tiny mast through the waves. The element of surprise, which the Snorkel was supposed to restore, was now entirely in the hands of the Allied air patrols. The U-boat's supposed technological superiority was abruptly and violently nullified by the unseen eye of the 3-centimeter radar. The German High Command was slow to recognize the true nature of the new threat, initially attributing losses to simple bad luck or poor crew judgment. This delayed realization was itself a fatal consequence of the Allied radar's silent, invisible effectiveness. The battle for the Atlantic had transitioned from a physical contest to a technological one, and Germany was now lagging critically behind. The stark reality of the Centimetric radar's effect was revealed in the devastating U-boat loss figures of late 1944 and early 1945. The Snorkel, once hailed as the savior of the fleet, was now exposed as a deadly beacon for Allied hunters. U-boat commanders, many of whom had been the most successful aces of the earlier war, saw their efforts repeatedly thwarted. The new operational environment meant that many U-boats were destroyed not during attack, but while merely trying to cross the shipping lanes. The losses in the heavily patrolled approach to the British Isles and the Bay of Biscay became unsustainable. The attrition rate climbed back toward the disastrous levels of Black May, signaling the complete failure of the Snorkel as a long-term solution. The High Command's trust in the Snorkel was finally and irreversibly broken by the indisputable evidence of their sunken fleet. They realized that a brief period of operational stealth had been brutally followed by a period of devastating, technologically-driven vulnerability. The crews were fighting against a threat they could not see and a technology they could not jam or avoid. The deployment of the Snorkel, while initially a clever countermeasure, had simply defined the new target for Allied radar development. The new Type XXI U-boat, designed to be truly independent and much faster underwater, was too late and too few to change the course of the war. The ultimate failure lay in the inability of German engineers to keep pace with the rapid, continuous innovation of Allied science. The technological gap widened, making the U-boat war an increasingly one-sided slaughter. The devastating reveal was not just about the losses, but about the total collapse of the German submarine strategy. The German commanders were forced to accept that the age of the Wolfpack and the conventional U-boat was over. The story of the Snorkel U-boats represents a classic, defining chapter in the history of military technology and counter-technology. It was a brilliant, almost successful attempt by the German Navy to maintain its relevance in the face of overwhelming opposition. The Snorkel fundamentally changed the operational doctrine of the submarine, proving the necessity of prolonged submerged capability. The Allied countermeasure, the Centimetric radar, became a symbol of the scientific and industrial power that ultimately decided the war's outcome. The technological race between the Snorkel and the radar was a microcosm of the larger, global conflict. Though a tactical failure in the long run, the Snorkel concept survived the war and became standard equipment on post-war submarines globally. It laid the crucial groundwork for the true underwater independence later achieved by nuclear propulsion. The German commander's faith, though misplaced in the face of radar's rapid evolution, was based on sound principles of submarine warfare. The experience of fighting the Snorkel forced the Allies to revolutionize their anti-submarine warfare techniques, lessons that continue to inform modern navies. The psychological and physical endurance of the U-boat crews during the Snorkel period stands as a grim testament to the realities of war beneath the waves. The battle between the thin, breathing mast and the unseen, high-frequency radio wave remains one of the most compelling strategic duels of World War II. The final victory belonged not to the Snorkel, but to the scientists who could make the invisible enemy visible. The Snorkel U-boat, a last desperate innovation, was ultimately overcome by the penetrating power of radar technology. The deep game of cat and mouse continues today, but its rules were irrevocably written by the Snorkel's initial promise and its final failure.